Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to get into something I've always found super interesting, personality testing.
Oh yeah, for sure. It can be pretty complex though, trying to figure out what makes people tick, right?
Exactly. And there are some really creative ways to do it. We're going beyond those basic question and answer tests, like, the ones you see online all the time.
Right.
We're going to dive into something called projective tests. These tests, they use like ambiguous stimuli to try to tap into our unconscious thoughts and feelings, the stuff we're not even aware of.
Yeah. They're really based on the idea that your interpretation of something kind of vague says more about you than the thing itself.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So it's kind of like that, the Wilshak test with the
Yeah.
ink blots and all that.
Kind of, but instead of ink blocks, we were looking at the thematic apperception test. You've probably heard of it, the TAT.
The TAT, okay.
So with this, you're shown pictures, but these are pictures of people. They're in these ambiguous situations, and you're asked to make up stories about them.
Wow, interesting. So instead of just blobs, it's actual scenes with people, but still ambiguous. I'm already curious how this works.
Yeah, and the TAD, it really goes deeper than just conscious thought. It's rooted in psychodynamic psychology, which focuses on the idea that our unconscious conflicts, often from past experiences, can influence our behavior.
Okay, so we're talking like Freud and that whole realm.
Yeah, it has that Freudian influence. So
Yeah.
someone might see one picture and interpret it totally differently from another person.
Yeah.
And that's because of their own experiences and subconscious thoughts.
That makes a lot of sense. So walk me through this. How does this actually work? Who came up with this?
Well, the guy behind the TAT, his name was Henry Amory.
Okay.
And he believed that people's interpretations of these ambiguous situations could actually reveal hidden aspects of their personality. So back in 1938, he did a study where he showed these pictures to a bunch of young men, all in their 20s. And he'd asked them to tell a story about each picture.
Mm-hmm.
What led up to the moment of the picture? What are the characters thinking and feeling? And then what happens next?
So it's like storytelling meets psychoanalysis.
Pretty much.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. But did he actually find anything? Like, did these stories actually reveal anything about their hidden desires or motivations?
They did. Murray found that the stories generally fell into four main categories.
Okay.
So there were stories based on books and movies, then events that happened to other people, and then, of course, their own personal experiences. And lastly, their conscious or unconscious fantasies.
Interesting. So it's like they're drawing from all these different parts of their lives and their imaginations.
Exactly. And what's even more interesting is how they projected their own personalities and experiences onto these ambiguous scenes. So, for instance, Murray noticed that if a participant was a student, they were more likely to see the characters in the pictures as students, too.
Really? Okay, so they're kind of like inserting themselves into the picture, even though there's nothing specific to suggest it.
Right. Like it was almost unconscious.
Do you have any other examples of like how someone's personality kind of came through in their story?
Yeah, there was this one participant whose father was a ship's carpenter,
Okay.
and he had always wanted to travel himself. And so when shown a picture of two people just talking, he imagined they were adventurers planning a trip to South America. It was like his unconscious desire just kind of spilled out into the story.
That is wild. It's almost like the tat acted as a decoder ring for his inner thoughts.
Right. It's pretty amazing.
I get why this test has become so popular. It's kind of like a window into the unconscious,
Yeah,
right?
definitely.
But is there like a specific example that really stands out to you that shows how the tat can tap into those like deeper personal experiences?
Oh, for sure. So Murray had this participant who he called Vert.
Vert.
Vert had experienced a lot of trauma in his life, including some pretty rough stuff during World War I. And so when Murray showed him this picture of a boy sitting on a couch with what looked like a revolver next to him,
Mm.
Vert told this story about a boy who was thinking about suicide after his mother had died.
Oh, wow. That's intense. I mean, the image could really be interpreted in so many ways, but for him it was so specific and dark.
Right. And it really makes you wonder, like, how much of that story was directly connected to his own experiences.
Hmm.
It shows you how the tat can potentially bring those deep-seated fears and anxieties to the surface, even if someone isn't consciously aware of them.
Right. But I guess the thing is, like, different people could look at that same picture and see totally different things, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So how do you even begin to interpret something like that?
Well, that's where things get a little tricky. I mean,
Okay.
when they showed that same picture of the boy and the revolver to a 35-year-old teacher, he saw a man who had been wrongly imprisoned. and a 16-year-old thought it was just a scene from a game of hide and seek.
Wow. Okay, so it's really all over the place. The same image can evoke such a range of emotions and stories. It's like you're getting a glimpse into each person's unique world. But I gotta ask, with all this subjectivity, how can we be sure that the tat is actually accurate? I mean, couldn't different clinicians interpret the same story in totally different ways?
You're exactly right. That is one of the major criticisms of the TAT. It's reliability.
Okay, break that down for me. What do you mean by poor reliability?
Well, in the case of the TAT, it means that you could have two different clinicians listening to the same story and coming up with completely different interpretations.
So it's kind of like showing a piece of abstract art to three different art critics.
Exactly. You're going to get three different interpretations, right?
Right. And so then the question becomes, is it the test itself that's unreliable, or is it the person interpreting it?
That's the big debate. And some argue that the clinician could even be unknowingly projecting their own unconscious biases onto the stories they're hearing.
Wow. So then the TAP becomes like a projective test for the clinician, too.
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. Okay, but then there's also the issue of validity,
Validity.
which is basically like, does it actually measure what it claims to measure?
Yeah, exactly. So when it comes to the TAT, the question is, does it really reveal underlying personality traits and unconscious conflicts? And, well, the research is mixed. Some studies haven't found any significant differences between people who are considered normal and those with mental illnesses when they're given the TAT.
So maybe using it for like actual diagnosis could be problematic.
That's one of the concerns. And then there's also the question of whether it can predict real-life behavior.
Right, because someone could tell a story about, say, robbing a bank without ever actually doing it, right?
Exactly. Thoughts and actions aren't always aligned. So if the evidence for the TAT's validity is so shaky, why do people still use it?
That's what I'm wondering, like, what's the point if it's not really reliable or valid?
Well, there are a few reasons, and that's something we'll get into right after the break.
So, okay, if the TAT isn't, super reliable as a test, why are people still using it? What's the deal?
Well, it seems like there are a few reasons. So firstly, how clinicians actually use the TAT in practice is kind of different from how researchers use it, for studies.
Oh, okay. How so?
Well, researchers, they're often trying to, categorize and quantify the stories people tell, looking for these patterns and correlations. They're basically trying to turn these complex narratives into numbers and data points.
Makes sense. Data is important.
But clinicians, they use it more as a tool for opening up a conversation with their patients. It's less about diagnosis and more about understanding the person's, inner world they're experiencing.
So it's like they're using those stories as a jumping off point for a deeper conversation.
Exactly. And the TAT, it can make it easier for people to talk about, sensitive stuff they might not bring up otherwise.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's less threatening than just coming right out and asking someone about a traumatic experience, right?
Right. You can use the TAT to create a safe space for them to explore those feelings, but in a more indirect way.
I see. So it's like a way to get at those hidden anxieties and conflicts that might be driving their behavior, but, without making them feel judged or anything.
It's about helping them understand themselves better. And the TAT can be a valuable part of that process.
Okay, that's helpful. So the point isn't necessarily to interpret the stories literally, but to think about what they might symbolize or reveal about the person's inner world.
Precisely. And even if the TAT isn't perfect, it can still give us valuable insights. It's not the whole picture, but it's a piece of the puzzle.
I like that. A piece of the puzzle. Okay, so you were talking about some of the newer research with the TAT. What are some of the ways people are using it now?
Yeah. They're using it to study all sorts of things these days. One area is dissociative disorders.
Oh, interesting. You mean like dissociative identity disorder, the one that used to be called multiple personality disorder?
Yeah, exactly. That's a really complex one to study.
For sure.
But in 2001, there was this study that looked at TAT stories from people with dissociative disorders, and they found that their stories often had zero positive emotions in them. And they also did some pretty strange things during the testing, like switching between different personalities and even experiencing amnesia.
Wow, that's heavy stuff. It sounds like the TAT could be a really useful tool for understanding those types of disorders, though, right?
Yeah, definitely. Could be really helpful.
Okay. Any other interesting research applications?
Yeah, another area where they're using the TAT is in studying personality disorders.
Okay. So we're talking about antisocial personality disorder, borderline, narcissistic.
Yeah, exactly. And there's research suggesting that the TAT can actually be pretty good at, like, differentiating between those different disorders.
Mm.
And what's even cooler is that the TAT results tend to match up with other personality assessments, like the MMPI.
That's really interesting. So maybe the TAT does have some value when it comes to understanding those more like challenging conditions, right?
It's looking that way. But, you got to talk about something that often gets overlooked with the TAT, the role of culture.
Oh, right. Culture. Of course, different cultures have different values and beliefs and like ways of expressing themselves.
Exactly. And those differences are going to show up in the stories people tell. I mean, what might seem like anxiety in one culture could be totally normal in another.
So clinicians really need to be aware of those cultural differences when they're interpreting the stories, right?
Mhm.
It's not just a like one size fits all kind of test.
You got it. The TAT can be a powerful tool, but it's definitely not a magic bullet. You got to use it responsibly and interpret it carefully.
It's about being sensitive to cultural differences and being aware of its limitations. And just realizing that, it's not the whole story, it's just a piece of it.
Exactly.
It seems like there's a common thread running through all of this, whether we're talking about clinicians using it to start a conversation or researchers exploring its applications in different groups of people. The point is to not take the stories literally, but to see them as a starting point for understanding, right?
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
And it seems like a lot of clinicians feel the same way. Like one psychotherapist said, and I quote, "I don't score my clients' responses on the TAT. I don't use it for formal diagnosis. But for me, those drawings are a wonderful and valuable way to bring troubled areas in a client's life to light. Identifying and being aware of these issues during the TAP process, it allows for more focused and effective therapy."
So it's less about labeling or diagnosing people and more about helping them become more self-aware and create a space for healing. Okay, well, I think we've taken a pretty deep dive into the TAT today. We've covered its history, its theoretical background, all the debates about its reliability and validity.
We've seen how it can potentially unlock those hidden emotions and thoughts, the unconscious stuff that shapes us.
And we've talked about how important it is to consider culture and individual experiences when interpreting those stories. It really seems like the TAT, even with all its, issues, it can be a really useful tool for understanding people. And it reminds us that like understanding people isn't always about having these, clear-cut answers or putting people in these neat little boxes.
Right. Sometimes it's more about just embracing the ambiguity and complexity of human experience.
I love that. Okay, so what does all this mean for our listeners? What can they take away from our deep dive into the TAT?
Well, I think maybe the biggest takeaway is that there's always more to us than meets the eye. Like our conscious awareness is just the tip of the iceberg.
It's like one of those optical illusions where at first you see one thing, but then when you like really look at it, there's a whole other image hidden inside.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And the TAC can help us see those hidden images within ourselves. Those unconscious patterns and motivations that we might not even realize are influencing our behavior.
It's kind of a reminder that our past experiences, even the ones we've totally forgotten about, can still have a huge impact on our lives today.
Absolutely. And even though the TAP might not give us like all the answers, it can definitely spark our curiosity. It can encourage us to, explore the complexities of being human.
For sure. So as we wrap up our deep dive today, we want to leave you with one last, thought-provoking question. If you were given the TAT, what kind of stories do you think you would tell? What do you think those stories would reveal about you?
It's definitely something to think about. I mean, you might surprise yourself.
And if you're interested in learning more about projective testing, there are tons of resources out there.
Yeah. Look online, check out your local library.
It can be a really rewarding journey of self-discovery.
Totally.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. See you next time.